Today, we're really plunging into some deep waters, intellectually speaking. We're tackling a truly monumental work, Michel Foucault's The Order of Things.
It's definitely a challenging read, but incredibly rewarding. Foucault is basically trying to map the hidden architecture of Western thought.
Not just a history of ideas, but something deeper. It's got quite the reputation. Hayden White called it Foucault's most important work.
High praise indeed. And Frank Kermode really nailed it, I think, praising Foucault's brilliant ingenuity in showing how people just accept the ways things are categorized in their time.
Without questioning how arbitrary those categories might be.
Precisely. How we sort the world seems natural, but Foucault shows it's historically constructed.
So that's our big question for this deep dive. How did Western thought organize knowledge across different eras? What were these fundamental shifts in the order of things? Especially concerning, say, language, life, wealth.
The big category.
Yeah. Okay, let's try and unpack this architecture of thinking.
Right. And first, let's be clear about the mission here, Foucault's mission. This isn't your standard intellectual history, tracing idea A to idea B.
Calls it an archaeology, doesn't it?
Exactly, an archaeology. He explicitly says it's a comparative and not a symptomatological study. He's digging for the underlying rules, the conditions of possibility that allowed sciences like biology, economics, linguistics to even exist and be structured the way they were in specific periods.
So not the spirit of the age or anything like that?
No, nothing so vague. He's after the fundamental code of knowledge, the epistemological space. He calls it the episteme. It's like the hidden operating system, that dictates what counts as knowledge and how you can even think about it in a given era.
An intellectual operating system. I like that. Okay, so let's boot up the first one. The Renaissance. Pre-17th century, roughly.
Right.
Before our, modern way of thinking took hold. How was knowledge structured? What was this episteme?
Okay, so for the Renaissance, the absolute core organizing principle was similitude, resemblance, likeness.
Similitude.
Yeah.
So everything was connected.
In their view, yes. Imagine a world where everything plants, animals, stars, human bodies, metals, echoes everything else in a vast, intricate web of hidden connections. Knowledge wasn't about isolating variables in an experiment. No, it was more about deciphering these resemblances, finding the hidden signatures that linked things together. It's a very different mindset, almost. Well, almost magical from our perspective.
It sounds incredibly poetic, actually. How did these similitudes work? Did Foucault break them down?
He did. He identifies four main types. The first is convenientia. This is resemblance through proximity, through adjacency. Things that are close together naturally influence each other or share quality. Think about how they saw the human body parts connected, reflecting each other. Or the classic microcosm idea, the universe mirroring the human being. Physical closeness implies a kind of bond, a shared nature.
Okay, sort of spatial harmony. What's the second type?
The second is emulatio. This is resemblance through rivalry or emulation, like a mirror image, but it doesn't require proximity. Things can echo each other across distance.
A mirror image? Like what?
Well, Foucault cites Paracelsus, who talked about man being constellated with stars, suggesting our inner being somehow mirrors the heavens. It's not just about being near, but about reflecting a common pattern. And there's that fascinating example Foucault uses, Pierre Belon's 1555 drawing comparing a human skeleton and a bird skeleton.
Oh, right, I remember that. Looks like early comparative anatomy.
To us, yes. But Foucault argues that for the Renaissance mind, it wasn't about evolution or common ancestry, it was emulatio. They saw it as one form, the bird, emulating or mirroring the human form, showing a consistent divine design, like an echo in structure. Visual resonance, not historical connection.
That really highlights the difference in their fundamental logic. Okay, so convenientia, emulatio. What's third?
Third is analogy. This one's maybe more familiar. It's resemblance through shared relations or proportions, often across different scales. It allows for broader comparison.
Like metaphors, almost?
Sort of, but they saw it as more real. The classic example is mapping the human body onto the earth. Flesh is like soil, bones are like rocks, veins are rivers, and so on. It's not a direct mirror image, but a similarity in structure or function, suggesting an underlying unifying principle governed how things worked.
Right, the microcosm reflecting the macrocosm again, but through structure. And the last one, sympathy. That sounds powerful.
It really was. Sympathy and its opposite, antipathy, described resemblance through attraction or repulsion. It explained how things could influence each other across vast distances, drawn together or pushed apart by hidden forces.
So like magnets.
Or think about the balance of the elements fire and water's natural opposition mediated by air. Or, Foucault mentions, the supposed natural enmity between certain animals, like the rat of India and the crocodile. These hidden forces of attraction and repulsion were seen as animating the cosmos, creating harmony through dynamic tension.
Wow. So the whole universe is this intricate dance of likenesses. But you said these connections were often hidden. If they weren't obvious, how did people find them? How did they know aconite cured eye disease, for instance?
That's the crucial next piece. Signatures. These were the visible marks, the clues on the surface of things that indicated the hidden, invisible resemblances. They were the key to deciphering the world's secrets.
So the signature was like a label pointing to the hidden connection.
Exactly. The aconite plant might have a mark resembling an eye, or the famous example, the walnut shell looks like a skull, and the kernel inside looks exactly like the brain in appearance.
And that indicated it was good for head ailments.
Not based on chemistry, but on this visual clue, this signature. It's a sign left by nature, or God, to guide understanding.
But wait, if the signature is just another resemblance, doesn't that get its circular?
Absolutely. Foucault points this out very clearly. Resemblance needs a signature to be seen, but the signature is itself another resemblance. It creates what he calls a system of duplications. The world is layered with signs pointing to likenesses, which are themselves signs.
This sounds like an endless web.
It is. He describes knowledge as this constant zigzag course from resemblance to what resembles it, always trying to read the signs. Nature is trapped, he says, between semiology, the knowledge of signs, and hermeneutics, the knowledge of interpretation.
So understanding the world was fundamentally an act of interpretation, like reading a giant natural book.
That's a perfect way to put it. And this explains why hermeneutics and semiology were so intertwined, almost fused in the Renaissance. Hermeneutics was the skill of making the signs speak, finding their meaning. Semiology was the skill of identifying the signs, knowing where they were and how they worked.
You couldn't have one without the other.
You couldn't. Foucault says to search for a meaning is to bring to light a resemblance. To search for the law governing signs is to discover the things that are alike. It's a constant interplay.
And this is where things like magic and scholarship weren't so separate.
Divinatio, deciphering God's signs in nature, like astrology or reading auspices, and erudition, interpreting ancient texts, the scriptures, the classics, were fundamentally part of the same intellectual project. Both were about uncovering and interpreting signs. A scholar poring over an ancient Greek text and an alchemist studying the properties of metals based on signatures were engaged in a similar kind of knowing.
That is really mind-bending. It collapses distinctions we take for granted. And what about language itself in all this? You mentioned texts. Did writing have a special role?
A huge role. There was a distinct primacy of writing. This might seem counterintuitive to us, thinking of language as primarily spoken.
Right. Speech comes first, then writing.
Not for them, not really. They often believed that ancient languages, especially Hebrew, held the key, that they preserved the radical similitudes from a time before Babel, maybe even the language Adam spoke with God and the animals. Writing was seen as closer to this original, true language.
Wow.
And this idea got a massive boost from things like the invention of printing, which fixed language in a durable form, and the influx of manuscripts from the East. Literature began to be seen as something read silently, individually, not just performed. So the primal nature of language, Foucault argues, was increasingly seen as written. Spoken words were just fleeting copies.
So the written word wasn't just a record. It was almost closer to the truth of things.
That seems to be the implication within that episteme. It held a privileged place in this world of signs and resemblances.
Okay, that gives us a really vivid picture of the Renaissance mind. But now, Foucault argues, this whole intricate system collapses. Mid-17th century. A great rupture. Not gradual change, but a fundamental break.
Yes, this is one of Foucault's most dramatic claims. The episteme shifts violently. The world of similitude, of endless resemblances and interpretation, fractures. It's replaced by a new organizing principle. Order, identity, and difference.
Order, identity, difference.
Right.
So out goes, this is like that, in comes, this is this, and it's not that.
Precisely. Analysis, measurement, classification, these become the dominant modes of knowing. The seamless web of likeness breaks apart.
And Foucault uses Don Quixote as a kind of marker for this shift.
Famously, yes. He calls it the first modern work of literature because it dramatizes this very rupture. Don Quixote is the hero of the same, lost in a world governed by resemblance, while reality now operates on the cruel reason of identities and differences.
He sees giants where there are windmills.
Exactly. He's trying to read the world using the old code, Renaissance Episteme of Similitude, but language has broken off its old kinship with things. His madness is the sign of this disconnect. He can no longer correctly map signs onto reality because the underlying system has changed.
So in this new classical age, as Foucault calls it, resemblance becomes suspect or marginalized.
Very much so. He points to two figures who become emblematic of the edges of this new order: the madman and the poet. The madman is now alienated in analogy. He sees only resemblances, endlessly, pathologically, and so he can't grasp difference. He can't order reality.
Unlike the Renaissance madman, who might have held a kind of truth.
Right. And the poet, conversely, is the one who tries to find a language beneath the new system of signs, trying to recapture that lost world of deep resemblance. Both are pushed to the margins because the mainstream of knowledge is now about clear distinctions. What has become important is no longer resemblances, but identities and differences.
And that Borges example, the Chinese encyclopedia?
Ah, yes, the list of animals. Belonging to the emperor, embalmed ones, suckling pigs, sirens, fabulous ones. It sounds absurd, right?
Completely random.
Foucault uses it brilliantly. The point isn't that the classification itself is inherently mad, but that it highlights the absence of a common ground, a coherent table upon which such disparate things could be logically ordered in our way of thinking, or even in the classical way. It shows that the very space where Renaissance resemblances could meet and make sense has been destroyed. It reveals the unthinkable space that opens up when one system of order collapses before another solidifies. It shatters the illusion of a single natural order.
That's a very powerful image for such a profound shift. Okay, so if similitude is out and order is in, how did this new classical mind represent the world? Foucault starts the whole book with Velázquez's painting Las Meninas. What did that painting show us about this new episteme?
Las Meninas is absolutely central for Foucault. He reads it as a perfect representation of classical representation itself. It's a painting, about seeing and being seen within this new framework.
How so? It's quite a complex scene.
It is. You have Velázquez, the painter, looking out from the canvas at us, the viewers. We are implicitly the model he's painting, so we are observing ourselves being observed by the painter.
Right. There's that strange loop.
And the central figures, the Infanta and her attendants, they also seem to be looking out, perhaps the same figures we represent the king and queen, whose portrait Velázquez is supposedly working on.
Yeah.
But the key is the mirror in the background. It's brightly lit. What does it reflect? Not the back of the Infanta, which would be geometrically logical. No, it reflects the hazy images of the king and queen.
The ones who are outside the painting, where we, the viewers, are standing.
The mirror performs what Foucault calls a metathesis of visibility. It makes visible what is necessarily doubly invisible within the painting's frame. The sovereign subject who is commissioning the painting and is its implied focus, and the spectator looking at it. The mirror shows what the painting itself cannot directly depict: its own conditions of being seen, its relationship to the power observing it.
Wow. So the painting is about the structure of representation itself, what it shows, what it hides, and the position of the observer and the ultimate subject.
It's a masterclass in how classical thought understood representation as a structured system of signs, gazes, presences, and absences, all carefully ordered. Knowledge isn't about finding hidden depths like in the Renaissance. It's about mapping the surface, understanding the system, the table, the order of representations.
Okay, so this drive for order, for clear classification and representation, must have reshaped everything. How did it manifest in specific fields? You mentioned mathesis and taxonomia.
Right. Foucault says this relation to order is as essential to the classical age as the relation to interpretation was to the Renaissance. Mathesis is the idea of a universal science of order, often mathematical in inspiration, think Descartes, Leibniz. Taxonomia is the practice of classification, of creating ordered tables.
Like Linnaeus with plants and animals.
Signs completely change their function. They aren't clues to hidden likenesses anymore. They become tools of analysis, marks of identity and difference, principles whereby things can be reduced to order, keys for a taxonomy. The goal is to create a vast, ordered table of all knowledge.
And representation and signs become almost the same thing.
They totally interpenetrate. Foucault argues that in this period, every representation is a sign, and every sign functions within the system of representation. This means, crucially, there's no separate theory of signification needed. Meaning isn't some deep essence behind the sign.
It's just the sign's place in the system.
Meaning cannot be anything more than the totality of the signs arranged in their progression. It's all on the surface, in the structure, in the table.
What about imagination? In the Renaissance, it seemed linked to finding those resemblances. What does it do now?
Its role flips. Imagination is no longer about discovering similitude. It's now seen more as the faculty that reconstitutes order from the chaos of sense impressions. It helps piece together representations, but it's also dangerous.
Dangerous how?
Because it can create false resemblances, it can blur the clear lines of identity and difference that the classical age valued so highly. It can obscure analysis. So imagination has to be disciplined by reason and observation. It's associated with error as much as with synthesis.
Fascinating. So if order and clear representation are key, what happened to language? What was general grammar?
General grammar wasn't about comparing different languages historically like we do now. Its generality came from its goal, to reveal the universal way language functions as representation. How does language mirror the order of thought? That was the central question.
So finding the universal logic behind all languages.
Essentially, yes. It explored the idea of a possible universal language, not a rediscovered ancient tongue, but a perfectly logical, artificial system of signs that could represent any thought clearly and without ambiguity, like a perfect calculus of thought. And relatedly, it explored universal discourse, the idea of a natural progression of the mind from simple ideas to complex analysis, a kind of universal logic of reasoning that language should reflect. Foucault calls this underlying framework ideology, not in the political sense we use today, but as the fundamental grammar of thought itself in that era.
And this involved a kind of nominalism, a focus on names.
Definitely. Thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, Condillac, they were deeply nominalist. They distrusted vague, general terms and focused on how language could precisely name distinct ideas and perceptions. Clarity and designation were paramount.
So the name becomes central.
Absolutely. Foucault writes, it is the name that organizes all classical discourse. The goal of language was accurate nomination, finding the right word to pin down the right thought or thing, creating that transparent link.
And language itself was seen as existing in a kind of space, not time.
Right, a tropological space. The focus wasn't on how words changed meaning over time, etymology wasn't central yet, but on how they related to each other in a structured system, how they could be arranged and substituted within the order of discourse. It's about spatial arrangement, not historical development.
Okay, so language as a precise map of thought. How did this apply to the natural world? What did natural history look like in the classical age?
It was all about classification, about creating that perfect table of nature. Observation shifted dramatically away from seeking hidden Renaissance similitudes. Linnaeus basically said, forget obscure likenesses, they just confuse things.
So focus on what you can clearly see and measure.
Exactly. Focus on seeing a few things systematically, the visible characters of a plant or animal, its form, the number of its parts, their arrangement, their size. These allow you to place it definitively in a taxonomic system. Think of those incredibly detailed botanical illustrations.
The goal was a perfect catalog.
A perfect catalog. And crucially, life itself wasn't really a concept in the way we understand it. There were living beings, yes, but life as a distinct force or biological principle didn't exist as a central object of study.
Really? So how do they distinguish plants from animals or living from non-living?
Based on observable characteristics within the classification system, does it grow? Does it move? Does it feel? These were criteria for sorting things into categories, minerals, vegetables, animals. But the line between living and non-living wasn't this huge philosophical problem it became later. It was just another distinction within the table.
Life is a category, not a force. That is a huge difference. Okay, last piece of the classical puzzle. Wealth. How did mercantilism fit into this picture of order and representation?
Wealth and money also get reinterpreted through this lens. The Renaissance idea that precious metals had intrinsic value, a kind of natural worth, dissolves.
So money isn't valuable in itself anymore?
Its value becomes primarily representative. In the 17th century, money's key function is as a sign, a substitute for other things that have value or price. It permits wealth to be represented, making exchange possible across different goods.
But it still had to be made of precious metal, right?
Yes, and that's the interesting paradox Foucault points out. Money had to be wealth, precious, in order to reliably signify wealth. But its primary function became signification, representation. It was valuable because it was the universal sign for exchange.
So mercantilism, archaeologically speaking, was about aligning ideas about money and prices with this broader system of representation.
It was the effort to understand wealth as something that could be analyzed, exchanged based on quantifiable units, and signified through precious metals. Wealth became another domain ordered by signs and their representative power.
Okay, we've mapped the Renaissance world of similitude and the classical age of order. But Foucault doesn't stop there. Around the turn of the 19th century, another earthquake.
Another massive discontinuity, yes. The second discontinuity. This is where the organizing principle shifts again, from static order to dynamic history. Time, development, evolution, these become the new axes of knowledge.
The operating system gets another total overhaul.
Pretty much. Foucault calls it a profound breach. The old way of knowing, based on representation mirroring itself, just isn't sufficient anymore. New conditions of possibility emerge. History isn't just a chronicle of events. It becomes the very medium through which things are understood.
So how did this historical lens transform our key areas? Labor, life, and language. Let's start with economics.
Okay, in political economy, the big shift is the birth of labor as the central concept. Adam Smith is key here. He introduces labor, real human toil, time, effort, finitude as the fundamental source and measure of wealth.
Replacing the classical focus on exchange and representation of value.
Yes, value is no longer just a sign. Foucault says value has ceased to be a sign, it has become a product. The theory of production now comes before the theory of circulation or exchange. Wealth originates in human activity over time.
And Ricardo takes this further.
Ricardo solidifies this by grounding economics explicitly in history. He analyzes production as a great linear, homogeneous series developing over time. This breaks decisively from the classical focus on the simultaneous relationships in a system of exchange. Economics becomes fundamentally historical, concerned with development, accumulation, scarcity over time.
Okay, so economics becomes historical. What about biology? Life wasn't really a thing in the classical age.
But now, life gains autonomy. It becomes its own distinct object of knowledge, not just a classification category. The focus shifts from external, visible characters to the internal organic structure and the functional importance of parts within a living system.
So looking inside how things work together.
Thinkers like Cuvier emphasize how organs function together, how the organism maintains itself as a coherent living whole. Life itself becomes a force, a process to be studied.
And Cuvier, with his fixism, the idea that species don't change, how does he fit into this birth of historical thinking about life? That seems contradictory.
It seems paradoxical, but Foucault's reading is subtle. By insisting on the distinctness and internal coherence of each species and its specific conditions of existence, Cuvier introduced radical discontinuity into the old, smooth, continuous chain of being. He defined species as stable, bounded entities. And by doing that, Foucault argues, he paradoxically gave them the status of objects that could have a history. Each fixed species now existed in time, potentially subject to appearance or extinction.
So by fixing the species, he made it possible to think about their history as distinct species, unlike Lamarck's continuous flow.
That's Foucault's interpretation. Cuvier's discontinuities created the conceptual space for a history of nature composed of distinct biological events and forms, rather than just a continuous unfolding.
Fascinating. And linguistics. Language moves beyond just representation.
Yes. In linguistics, language is no longer just a tool for ordering thought. It acquires depth, an internal architecture, a historical reverse side. The focus shifts to its internal structure, inflectional systems, grammar, sound changes, and the laws of mutation proper to words alone.
So how language itself changes over time. Philology.
Precisely. The birth of comparative philology, tracing language families, studying sound shifts like Grimm's law, language becomes an object with its own history and internal dynamics.
And Foucault connects this to formalism and the unconscious. That sounds like a leap.
It's a provocative connection. He suggests this inward turn leads language down two paths in the 19th century. On one hand, towards formalism, analyzing language as an abstract system, leading towards structural linguistics, logic, Russell. On the other hand, towards the unconscious, seeing language as expressing something deeper, hidden desires or structures within the human psyche, leading towards psychoanalysis, Freud.
So language becomes both a formal object and a carrier of hidden depth.
That's the tension he identifies. And alongside this, he argues, emerges the modern concept of literature as such. Not just any writing, but language used in a special way, drawing attention to itself, exploring its own ambiguities and densities. Language becomes opaque, an enigma, not just a transparent window.
This is huge. Labor, life, language, all historicized, all gaining this internal depth. What did this do to philosophy and to the idea of studying human beings, the human sciences?
It created a completely new landscape. On one side, you get the increasing isolation of pure forms, mathematics, formal logic, striving for abstraction.
The formal sciences.
Right. But on the other side, these newly historicized empirical domains, biology, economics, linguistics, become deeply linked with reflections on subjectivity, the human being, and finitude. Man emerges as a central problem.
How so?
Because these sciences study aspects of human existence, our biological nature, our economic activity, our language, but they do so empirically, historically. This raises philosophical questions about what it means to be human, about our limits, our mortality, our place in history.
So the human sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology are born in this space.
Foucault argues they occupy a precarious position, what he calls the epistemological trihedron. They sit in the interstices, the gaps, between three things: the formal sciences, the empirical sciences, life, labor, language, and philosophical reflection on human finitude. They're always trying to navigate between mathematical rigor, empirical observation, and philosophical questions about being human. This makes them inherently unstable and prone to methodological crises.
And vulnerable to anthropologism. What's that?
It's the danger of trying to reduce all knowledge back to man, of making psychology or sociology the ultimate foundation for everything else, overstepping their bounds. It's the risk of claiming a universal understanding of the human subject that ignores the specific historical and epistemological conditions Foucault is tracing.
And the unconscious becomes a key problem for them.
Yes, Foucault says the problem of the unconscious is coextensive with their very existence, because the human sciences are always dealing with structures, forces, histories, economic, linguistic, psychological, that shape human beings but operate largely outside conscious awareness. They are constantly trying to unveil the non-conscious.
And history plays a double role here.
A very tricky double role. History gives the human sciences their homeland, their context, defining man as a historical being. But it also limits them because it shows that any understanding of man is itself historically situated, culturally specific, never universal or final. History both enables and relativizes the human sciences.
So this modern condition Foucault describes, it sounds complex, fragmented, maybe even anxious. What does it mean for our understanding of ourselves? That classic, I think, therefore I am, does that still hold?
Foucault suggests it becomes much more problematic. The modern condition is marked by finitude and the same. The modern, I think, is embedded in a density. The density of language we don't fully control, the history we inherit, the economic forces that shape us, the biological life that carries us. It's hard to get to a simple, clear I am out of that complex web.
We can't step outside our own history or biology or language.
Exactly. And when modern thought tries to find an origin, the origin of language, of society, of life, it finds only its constant recession. The origin point always retreats further back, remaining elusive. It's a defining feature of modern thought.
We're always chasing something we can't quite grasp.
And this connects to the analysis of finitude and its doubles. Modern thought is obsessed with our limits, finitude, but also with how our empirical experience is tied to underlying conditions we don't fully grasp, the empirico-transcendental double. How our conscious thought rests on a vast unthought, and how the origin keeps receding. These concerns, Foucault suggests, parallel the classical age's focus on representation and language, but now they express our relationship to a complex exteriority and our own dispersed finite being.
So if the classical age was about ordering differences, the modern age is about
the ever-to-be-accomplished unveiling of the same. Trying to grasp identity, the self, the origin. But paradoxically, this quest always reveals the double, the gap, the hiatus within identity. We find ourselves mirrored yet separate, empirical and transcendental, conscious and unconscious. Modern identity is fractured, always separated from itself by an internal distance.
Wow. That's a lot. We've covered an immense amount of ground moving through these seismic shifts in how knowledge itself was constituted. From Renaissance resemblance
To classical order and representation.
and into the modern age of history, finitude, and the complex, problematic emergence of man.
It really underscores Foucault's core idea. These shifts aren't gradual developments. They are profound breaches, radical events, discontinuities in the very mode of being of things, as he puts it.
And he found the clues not just in philosophers like Kant or Hegel.
No. Crucially, he looked to Cuvier in biology, Bopp in linguistics, Ricardo in economics. He believed the real evidence for these epistemic shifts lies in the concrete practices and transformations within the empirical sciences themselves. They show the fault lines.
That's a really powerful takeaway. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If the order of things isn't fixed, if it's historically constructed through these hidden epistemes, well, what about our own time?
What is the episteme now?
Right. How are our current ways of ordering the world, maybe through data, algorithms, networks, neuroscience, how are they shaping what we can even think or see? And maybe more importantly, what are they making us unable to see? Are there signatures of our own time we're missing? Is another rupture happening right under our noses?
Those are the questions Foucault leaves us with, aren't they?
Definitely something to chew on. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive today. And listeners, perhaps take a moment to consider the frameworks shaping your own fields, your own thinking. Where are the hidden orders, the potential discontinuities? Food for thought. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.